What if everyone keeps telling you that you look like a famous actor on TV or film? And what if that resemblance wasn't an accident? That's the basis of the story, The Afflecktion #1 from Dylan Pevin and Xander Bice. And we're going to talk about it right here. See you in 3. And welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of indie comic The Afflecktion #1 from Dylan Pevin and Xander Bice, now available on Kickstarter. And in this issue, we begin a surreal fantasy about a man whose resemblance to a certain famous actor, hint, it's in the title, leads to a supernatural conspiracy. But before we get started, please like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that bell for notification. Your attention is greatly appreciated. Make sure to stay tuned to the end for the final score. Credits. The Afflecktion #1 is written by Dylan Pevin, art by Xander Bice, who also does the letters and the cover art, and colors are by Nicholas Michael. So what is this about? This sounds kind of strange. It sounds kind of weird, right? But it takes the foundation from a real event and then decides to, well, what happens? What if? We're going to ask what if. So we have a gentleman by the name of Ari Ben Avram. He's a real person. He's a real literary agent that works out in real life, and he is constantly, perennially confused with Ben Affleck, as the name implies. This story kind of takes that notion and goes a little bit further by wondering, what if he looks like Ben Affleck for a reason? What if he's not the only one that looks like Ben Affleck? And what if the reason so many men start cropping up that look like Ben Affleck is due to a supernatural force that can be more destructive than anything else? And what if Ben Affleck is some sort of, how should we put it, vampire? That is changing men into him so that he can retain his youth and his vitality and his power. Think of it as Dorian Gray on a larger scale. And then you get the idea of what the Afflecktion is about. Now, that sounds like a strange concept. It's a very surreal concept, but honestly, it works for this story. And it makes a lot of sense because if you Google Ari Ben Avram, and you can see his picture from what he's posted on LinkedIn and some other places. Yes, he does indeed look like Ben Affleck. So even though this is based upon a real person with a real quote unquote problem, the nature of the story is very much rooted in fiction and sort of a surreal fantasy. And it just takes that concept and explodes it out into maybe not satirical levels, but just sort of strange, fantastical levels. This is going to be very short because the first issue is very much just an introduction to the second part, which we will review at a later point, but I wanted to give you the context for the first issue. So did we like the Afflecktion #1? What do we think about it? Honestly, it's kind of strange and kind of bizarre, if you want to look at it that way. The notion is we're following Ari through his normal life and how he is kind of annoyingly and frustratingly confused with Ben Affleck, and the character in the comic is an aspiring scriptwriter, and he wants to be recognized for his talent, and he's also has these feelings of envy and jealousy because Ben Affleck gets all these movies that are greenlit, and some of them are good, some of them are terrible, but Ari believes that he can do better. And so the fact that he wants to sort of effectively have Ben Affleck's life, but he also doesn't want to be confused with Ben Affleck at the same time, creates this weird sort of personal internal struggle that he has to deal with. But then once he finds out that as he grows older, he's sort of aging at an increased or rapid rate, and then he finds out that there are other men that are like him, and they've sort of pulled him into their circle to say, hey, this is not happening for no reason. We're getting older. We look like Ben Affleck if he would age at a normal rate, and putting on weight, and sort of every time his name is mentioned in our presence, we get physically ill and physically sick. And they realize that they have now been pulled into some kind of supernatural spell where the real Ben Affleck is feeding on them. And now we have a team that is fighting against a supernatural force that is feeding on them like some sort of spiritual or psychic vampire. And the absurdity of the situation kind of gives it some seriousness, but at the same time, also a little bit of humor just because of how strange and weird and bizarre the scenario is. So the concept is based on real life, but it's also very original at the same time on how they took that real life circumstance and exploded it out into something very unique. So just on pure creativity alone, the idea is worth your time. Plus, Generally speaking, dialogue's good. The scene structure is pretty solid. We get some flashbacks with Ari as he remembers times in college when during the early parts of Ben Affleck's career, where certain things would happen, where he would get confused early on with Ben Affleck by people that he knew, pretty girls, friends, what have you. But he noticed that every time they started to pay attention to him and give him that sort of attention is the right word. Gave him that attention because he looked like Ben Affleck. That somehow started to affect him at a physical level, and he just didn't think anything of it. But as time goes on, the symptoms get worse, but he's not connecting those dots. And now the events that happen in the present in this issue connect those dots, and now we have this sort of challenge on our hands, a quest, if you will, for the main character. So it's sort of serious, but kind of comical in the absurdity and the bizarreness of the setup, and it's very high on the curiosity scale as far as where it goes and how it's going to turn out. On the downside, the pacing on the first half of the issue is very, very slow. I mean, you're just sort of getting into his life, finding out what his day-to-day is like, watching him get up, watching him eat breakfast, open his mail. The pacing could use more pep in the beginning. If you stick with it, you are rewarded, which is a positive. But on the flip side of that, on the negative side, the beginning half-ish of the issue really relies on the reader to hang in there and show some patience, which is a really tough sell given the uniqueness of this concept and the selling point. So it would have been better if the beginning of this issue had a little bit more of a bang to kind of get people hooked, and then you can kind of backfill in some of the mundanities of Ari's life and trying to kind of get through what he's trying to get through while being mistaken for this famous person. But besides the pacing of the first half of the first third of the issue, generally speaking, it's a good solid comic. What about the art? So there's heavy reliance on this issue to make Ari and all the characters around him look like Ben Affleck. Do they look like Ben Affleck? Except for like the jawline and the chin, not really. It's a sort of a low fidelity not caricature, but a low fidelity representation of Ben Affleck. So you get the impression of Ben Affleck, but it doesn't really look like Ben Affleck. So they're not going for detail. They're not going for realism and high accuracy. They're just going for the impression and just relying on you to go along with them when they say that they've been told they look like Ben Affleck. But from the comic, it doesn't look like it. Ironically, if you look at the real life picture of Ari, he looks a lot more like Ben Affleck than he does in the comic. So take that for what it's worth. So the art's okay, but it probably would have hit more or hit harder if the comic versions of the characters really did look like Ben Affleck. You don't quite get there, but you can go with it enough to suspend disbelief. Final thoughts. What do you think of the Afflecktion? The Afflecktion #1 from Dylan Pevin and Xander Bryce. Very, very creative concept. Very imaginative plot. Just for something different to read, if you want something that's in that surreal fantasy fable kind of genre, and something that's wholly unique and wholly original, this is it. The art's okay, and as we pointed out, the one downside is that the beginning is slow. So as long as you stick with it, you'll get paid off. But if you want to get grabbed right away, you're going to struggle a little bit with this issue. That said, we're going to give the Afflecktion #1 from Xander Bryce and Dylan Pevin a 7 out of 10. What do you think? Do you like surreal, bizarre kind of fantasy stories that kind of borrow from real life? Or is that just not your cup of tea? Let us know in the comment section down below. And if you like comic reviews, please stay tuned through the outro for the next one.